The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me what I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a just angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your teacher. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended." And he took Thomas and withdrew and spoke 3 things to him. When Thomas came back to his friends, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things he spoke to me, you will pick up rocks and stone me, and fire will come from the rocks and devour you." The gospel inspired by God. There are 2 of the Gospels that were found in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And at this stage, you know well what the background and the context is. In the year 367 AD, the very, very tolerant and very wise bishop of Alexandria, a guy called Athanasius, decreed that all pagan literature and all Gnostic material should be burned. And so there was a tremendous effort in monasteries all over the Middle East to hide sacred manuscripts. And sometimes they actually buried them with the monks, and sometimes they hid them in caves. And this material was lost for over 1,500 years. And in 1895, some stuff was found in a monk's grave in a place called Oxyrhynchus, and it consisted of the Gospel of Mary of Magdala. And then in 1945, there was a whole treasure trove of stuff found in a cave in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. So the 2 Gospels we read from this morning, Gospel of Phillip, that the 2 first readings came from, and the 3rd reading from the Gospel of Thomas, they were part of that cache of materials found in 1945. And the first Gospel we read this morning, the Gospel of Phillip, that Nina and Bob did for us, is probably most famous for the inference that can be taken from it, that Jesus and Mary of Magdala were, the word given is companions. And read into this is that they were lovers or that they were husband and wife. And so you find it in Philip's Gospel, the Gnostic Gospel, the kind of the information leading to this. The difficulty is, very definitely, Jesus had a very special relationship with Mary. And so much so that the other disciples were really, really upset. And they said to him in Philip's Gospel, "Why do you love Mary more than you love us?" And then there's a very enigmatic passage that says, "He used to often kiss her on the mouth." Now, the problem with the translation is that in the actual physical text, there's a hole in the page. And so the translation is, he used to often kiss her on her mouth, but the word mouth is not there. There literally is a hole in the text. So it could have been, he was kissing her on the head, he was kissing her on the cheek, he was kissing her on the tush, who knows? So they put in the word mouth. But very definitely there's this special relationship between Jesus and Mary. She's called his companion. And the disciples ask him, they're really, really upset, and they said to him, "Why do you love her more than you love us?" And he responds by saying, "It's not so much that I love her more than I love you, I love her differently from how I love you." And then he illustrated it with a parable. He says, imagine 2 men are inside in a deep, 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 dark cave, and there's no light there. And one of the men is blind, and the other is sighted. But because they're in a deep, dark cave, neither of them can see. But then they come out of the cave into the light, and now the blind man still cannot see, but the sighted one can see. That's why I love Mary differently from how I love you guys. Now, the obvious implication is that they're the blind guys, and Mary is the sighted one. And they were all in the dark until the Christ light came, but when the Christ light came, Mary recognized it and the others didn't. The others are still dark. The others are still see Jesus as a job opportunity. And Mary maybe alone got it because Mary herself had a Christ consciousness. And Mary immediately recognized who he was. As soon as the light arrived, Mary recognized it. The others didn't. And so obviously then Christ had this totally different kind of a connection to her. So I want to begin with that text today. And I'm going to make just 4 main points this morning. The first one I will call the gift of language. The second one, the gift of parables. The third one, from de saussure to the sacraments. And then fourthly, Phillip and Thomas play Scrabble. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the gift of language. When you think about it, the transition from Homo sapiens to Homo sapiens sapiens. So Homo sapiens arrived on the scene about 200,000 years ago. They were thinking beings, but they didn't have language. That only came 150,000 years later. Homo sapiens sapiens arrived with the ability to speak languages. Now the question is, was that actually an advance or was it a retrograde step? So what did language give to us? So it's interesting that we are these creatures walking around and we've got this sensorium, we've got 5 senses that soak in data from outside, and then we operate on it with this black box that we carry between our ears, and we create some kind of an internalized model of what's out there. Now, the truth is we have no idea whether our model in any way corresponds to what's out there. In philosophy, there's a fallacy called the myth of the given. And the myth of the given is that we really believe that the models, our mental models of the world, correspond one-to-one with what's actually out there. We have no idea if that's true. All we can say is, when you operate on whatever is out there with these particular senses, with these particular ranges of each sense, and this particular kind of cognitive process, here is the model that you come up with. And because all humans basically have the same sensorium and the same mental abilities, we all create what look like particularly the same kinds of models. But if we had an extra sense, or if we lacked senses, our models would be radically different. If you can imagine a world in which only Helen Kellers live, so people who can see or hear or speak, what model of the world would the human species have if we were all Helen Kellers? It would be radically different from the model we have now. So our model is totally predicated on our sensorium, the particular 5 senses we have, the range of each of these senses. Even if we could extend a particular sense in a range, we would have a radically different notion of what's out there. So for instance, in Kenya, we had snakes called spitting cobras. And this cobra did not bite, it spat its venom, and it was deadly accurate for 5 or 6 yards, really deadly accurate. And it always aimed either for the eyes or if there was an open wound on the body. And the reason is that snakes see into the ultraviolet, into the infrared spectrum. And so when they look at a human body, they see it thermally. They see the heat spots, and that's what they aim their poison for. So if we could see into the infrared range, we'd have a different model of what's out there. Or you take, for instance, a dragonfly. A dragonfly has 2,700 facets to each of its 2 eyes. So it's impossible for us to even imagine what the visual impression that a dragonfly has flying over a field of gardens from what we have. It is radically different. Or you take a bat. A bat can hear sounds up to 100,000 hertz. We hear between 20 and 20,000. If we could hear below 20, we'd literally hear our own muscles creaking, literally. They can hear up to 100,000 hertz, which means a bat can have an acoustical image of a rose. We can't even imagine what we're talking about when we say an acoustical image of a rose. We can have a visual image or an olfactory image or a tactile image, but to have an acoustical image of a rose, it beggars description. We have no idea what this means. And so we are totally limited by the sensorium we have and the range of all these senses. If we had more senses or a greater range of any one of them, our maps of reality would be totally different. And so that's the problem for us. We soak in all these data, and then we operate it and we create a representation, and because all human beings have basically the same equipment, we agree on what that looks like. But here's the leap into language. So we have these maps in our minds because we've absorbed data through our sensorium and we have operated on it in our black boxes up here. How do I meet with Margaret Park? And Margaret Park can somehow make me aware of the map that's inside in her head as a result of her observations. That was the breakthrough of language in a sense. So it's an extraordinary feat that Margaret Park learned how to make particular sounds, and that somehow she was so clever that she could take sounds that actually represented what her mental images of the world were. And I was so intelligent, I could pick up on these sounds and translate them and create a map in my mind that corresponded to the map that she had in her mind. And somehow she's transferred her map from her mind to my mind. It's an extraordinary feat. This was the breakthrough of language. Now the question I ask myself is, was that a breakthrough or was it a breakdown? Because language is a very, very, very leaky vessel. I want you to take 5 seconds and just look around you. Look at this, at the ceiling, the floor, other people. Take 5 seconds to look around you. Now, if I were to ask any one of you, can you tell me what you saw? I guarantee you, if you were to really describe everything that was registered on your visual cortex, you'd be talking for the next 5 years. Literally. In 5 seconds, you've registered so much information that if you were to describe all of it, it would take you 5 years to describe it. So you're going to give me a tiny little synopsis. That's how poor language is. So what you manage somehow to appropriate in 5 seconds is going to take you 5 years to describe. That's the difficulty with language. So I sometimes think that language wasn't a gift as much as it was a retrograde step. What if before we had language, we had telepathy? What if before we had language, we had the ability to transfer entire scenarios from my cranium into yours, and that language actually broke that process down and made it really, really, really difficult? That's what people describe when they have near-death experiences. That they can, in a few seconds of Earth time, they can review an entire lifetime of events. Not just from their own perspective, but they can inhabit the moccasins of everybody involved in every single incident that they witness. And they can do that in 3 or 4 seconds. So it's like you can take an entire mindset and download it in this period of time. And that's the difference between telepathy and language. And so is language a great breakthrough, or was it a real retrograde step? Did we have telepathic abilities before we had language, and therefore in acquiring language did we lose something very, very important? I was just thinking this morning, maybe this is what the real meaning of the story of Babel is. The story of Babel, allegedly, is that at the beginning we all spoke one language. But we got uppity, and we started building towers, and the gods came down, and the gods got frightened that maybe we were going to outgrow them, so they determined to split our languages. So the normal interpretation of this is that there was one language, let's for the fun of it call it Sanskrit, and that everybody spoke Sanskrit, and we all understood each other. And then the gods got jealous, and they decided to make things difficult for us, so they broke us up into Indo-European languages, and African languages, and Afro-American Indian languages, or whatever. So, and then these split into Romance languages, and Celtic languages, etc. So that's the normal understanding of this. I'm thinking this morning that maybe it was much more interesting than that. That maybe what the gods found was that we were telepathic creatures, and we could just totally download whatever was in Margaret's mind. She could download totally to me, and I would get it instantaneously. And when you looked around this room for 5 seconds, you could download into my consciousness what you saw, and you wouldn't have to take the next 5 years to describe it to me. Maybe that's what happened, and that we went actually backwards. We lost the ability to be telepathic as we developed language skills. So that language is a two-sided sword. That's the first. That's the gift of language. Is there a gift? Was it a breakthrough? Or was it a breakdown? This brings me to my second point. The gift of parables. I think that this is the reason. The leakiness of language is the reason why mystics will always use a different form of language. So language kind of bifurcates into two basic groups. You get exoteric language and you get esoteric language. Exoteric language is a kind of a fundamentalist or a scientific notion of language where you're trying to describe something according to its kind of cognitive associations. So there's a difference then between that kind of language and what I've called mythish. Mythish is a very sacred language. But the fundamentalists reduce mythish down to literalism. And so when Jesus tells a parable, or they come across a great African story, they tend to interpret it literally, and this leads to a fundamentalist mindset. Our scientific materialism tends to think that mythish is just made up gibberish, and they both get it wrong. Mythish is a sacred, secret, mystical language. And when you speak mythish, you speak Jesus. And when you speak mythish, you understand what the guy was talking about this morning. These very convoluted readings that we got for us this morning. So Christ would speak in parables because parables are a form of mythish. Parables are like, mythish spoken with the Jesus accent. And so it's a particular kind of mythish. It's a real sacred language. But when you try to tie your spirituality through a different kind of language, it always falls. It becomes fundamentalism, which becomes intolerant, or it becomes scientific, materialistic thinking. And when you tie spirituality to that, it falls when the model changes. Because scientific models are constantly being updated. So if you try to articulate a spiritual teaching in scientific language, when the science changes, the theory is going to go down in flames with it. And that happened very spectacularly at the Council of Trent in 1546. The Council of Trent, they defined the doctrine of transubstantiation. And transubstantiation is the belief system that at the moment of consecration, the host becomes the body and blood of Jesus. And the word they used was transubstantiation. Now, in the science of the time, the word substance means what we now mean by essence. In the meantime, in the next 500 years, substance is now taken to be the physical or the chemical composition of something. So we appear to be saying now that at the moment of consecration, that if you take this host and analyze it, you find all the ingredients of a human body in it. It has tissue, and there's tendons, and big toes, and kidneys, and stuff like that. And so it's a meaningless phrase at this stage. So the church wrestled with this and tried to change it a few times. They thought of using the word transessentialization, but it never took. And they tried using the word transsignification, and it never took. So we're stuck with a word that means exactly the opposite of what it was intended to mean. So when you try to tie spirituality through a technical scientific term, when the terms change and science grows and evolves, the spirituality goes down with it. Which is why the great teachers will never use either philosophical terminology or theological terminology or scientific terminology. They'll speak in myths. They'll speak in parables. Because the beauty of a parable is everybody will unpack the parable according to the level that they've reached in their own spiritual journey. So you can tell exactly the same story to 100 people, and each person will unpack it depending on where they're at. And in your own lifetime, the way you unpack a parable today might be radically different from how you unpacked the same parable 25 years ago, as you're evolving yourself. And so the great teachers know that. They give us these teachings in mythish, in stories, in parables, so that each one of us can unpack it as we want. I used an example, and I think it was on Friday in St. Mark's Church. It's the equivalent of giving a teenager a birthday gift. You're some guy's aunt or some kid's aunt, and you give her a gift of clothes. A teenager doesn't want her aunt buying her clothes. Or you're the uncle and you buy your nephew a bunch of books. Your nephew has no interest in the books that you're interested in. So if you really want to give him a gift, give him $50 and let her buy the clothes she wants or buy the books he wants to be reading. And that's what Jesus does. Jesus always deals in cash. He always gives us the wherewithal to buy what we need to buy, to unpack stuff in the way in which we want to unpack it. And so that's the great gift of the parable and the story. It is mythish, and mythish allows us to translate the teaching in a way that makes sense to us where we are in our lives now. And the great gift is like money in a great interest-bearing account. You come back to it in 25 years' time, and the same story that you put in the bank 25 years ago, you take out now, and it's bringing you much, much, much deeper into your spirituality. So that's the great gift of parables. That's my second point. The third point then I've called from de Saussure to the sacraments. Ferdinand de Saussure was probably the greatest linguist of the 20th century. He was a Swiss linguist. He was born in 1857, died in 1913. And he wasn't a great linguist in the sense that he spoke many, many languages, but that he had theories of language, which subsequently really influenced the field hugely. And I'm not going to go into great detail about it, except to say that one of his basic tenets was that language exists at three levels. He called one the referent, the second one the signified, and the third the signifier. And here's what he meant by it. So let's say I'm walking in the bush in Kenya, and I come across this animal, this huge big 2-ton animal with a long skinny little tail and 4 big legs, and a huge proboscis that's touching the ground and 2 big ivory tusks. So that's the referent. That's the thing in the real world. Now I form an image inside in my head, and that he would call the signified. And then I want to tell you about it. And depending on who you are, if you're a Kipsigis man, I'll say Beliot. If you're Swahili, I'll say Ndovu. If you're English speaking, I'll say elephant. And so the signifier changes depending on the audience for whom it's intended. But the signified is the same. The image in the head is the same. But the image is some kind of representation of the thing in the real world. So there's a thing in the real world, there's the image I have, and there's the words I'm going to have to use in order to explain it to you. That was his theory. So it's a very elegant theory, but it doesn't really plumb the depths of language, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm going to go on a different hit this morning. You take a language, for instance, like Sanskrit. And allegedly Sanskrit was a language composed by the great rishis, the great ancient teachers of India. And they created a 51 symbol set. There are 15 vowel signs and 36 consonant signs. And the belief system was that these signs led to sounds, and that the sounds actually were the sounds of creation. And so when you speak a word in Sanskrit, you're not just kind of hanging an identity tag and saying, oh, this is a seat. But that when you speak a word in Sanskrit, you're bringing the thing actually into being. Now, the Aborigines of Australia had the very same idea. According to Aboriginal cosmology, the world as we know it was sung into being by the ancestors. So the sacred songs that the ancestors sang actually enfleshed in the material world in which we find ourselves. And therefore, an Aboriginal person will never ever attempt to cross a river or swim in it or climb a mountain until they know the music of the mountain or they know the music of the stream. They would not dare to interface with it until they knew the music, because it is a dialogue between two souls incarnated. So it was horrific to them, when the whites came from Europe and just trampled all over the terrain without ever learning the music of these places. It was really scandalous to them. Now, I think the same thing happens in the sacraments. For me, there's a big difference between signs, symbols, and sacraments. A sign is just one physical object standing for another physical object. So when you get into your car and you drive down Channing, at some stage you're going to come to a piece of metal, big square of metal, with yellow and black paint in it. And so that's this physical object. It's just a piece of metal with paint in it. But it's telling you that a few yards further on, you're going to meet a junction to your left. So it's one physical thing, the metal with paint on it, standing for a piece of tarmacadam. That's a sign. Sign is just one physical thing standing for another physical thing. A symbol is different. A symbol has one foot in physicality and the other foot in the non-physical. So, for instance, a kiss is a symbol. It's not a sign, it's a symbol. So the physical part of it is the meeting of two pairs of lips. The non-material part of it is the protestation of love or friendship. And so there's a non-physical part, which the physical part represents. So that's different from a sign. For a symbol then has a physical component and a non-physical component. Sacraments are very special forms of symbols because the symbols can tell lies. For instance, Judas kissed Jesus, ostensibly a demonstration of his love for Jesus, but it was actually a signal to betray him. So symbols can tell lies, and signs can tell lies. You can turn a sign around and point the road in the other direction, and people are going to get lost. But a sacrament cannot lie. A sacrament is a particular kind of symbol that actually accomplishes that which it symbolizes. And so when you really understand, for instance, Eucharist, and you come here on a Sunday and we celebrate Eucharist together, we're not celebrating an event that happened 2,000 years ago. If you really understand the sacrament, and if you really understand parable, and you really understand story and parable and sacrament are trans-temporal realities. As time fades, we're participating as fully in this mystery as the disciples did at the table 2,000 years ago. That is the beauty of sacrament. Sacrament actually causes to happen that which it symbolizes. And so it's a very special kind of language. It's like Sanskrit, or it's like the language of the Aborigines. It actually calls into being the very thing that it symbolizes. The last point I want to make then is this. I talk about Phillip and Thomas playing Scrabble. So if you followed these three readings this morning, they were very, very obtuse. Really, really difficult to unscramble because all three authors are playing around with words. So in the reading that Bob did for us, for instance, we are told that you don't understand the word God, you don't understand the word Father, you don't understand the word Son, you don't understand the phrase the Holy Spirit, you don't understand life, light, resurrection, or church. You haven't understood any of these words. And so we're messing around with words that we haven't fully understood because we've reduced mythish down to fundamentalism. That's basically what Phillip is saying this morning. But if we really understood the language, then we would have a totally different relationship. So in the reading that Nina did, there's a phrase where Phillip says, in order for Jesus to become the Father, he had to bear the name of the Father. Now what does that mean? In order for Jesus to become the Father, he had to bear the name of the Father. In other words, we become that which we know the name, that of which we know the name. When you know the name of something, you become that thing. We think names are just tags to differentiate Mikey from Johnny. They're not that at all. A name is a song your soul sings as it wings its way into incarnation. So your name isn't Mary Kate or Margaret or Lee or Sean. That's not your name. That's a tag that some parents hung on you to differentiate you from the other people in the family. But your real name Your real name was the song that your soul sang as it winged its way into incarnation. And when you get that name, you have a totally different relationship to reality. And this is the name. Because Jesus knew the Father's name, Jesus and the Father are one. To see me, Phillip, he said, is to see the Father. Because you know the Father's name, you are the Father. You are that whose name you know. And that's the beautiful passage in John's Gospel in chapter 20, where after the resurrection, Mary of Magdala has an encounter with Jesus, and she doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. And finally, Jesus just pronounces her name. And in the Gospel, it's Miriam, but that is not the word he spoke to her. Jesus sang her real name, and because she heard her real name being sung, she understood who it was that was singing to her, and then she recognized him, and then she flung herself at him. And so he didn't just kind of go down through his roster of apostles and say, oh, it's not Matthew, it's not Mark, it's not Luke, oh, you must be Miriam. That was not what was happening here. It was that he pronounced her sacred name, and because she was seen completely, she saw him completely. Now, the nearest thing I've ever seen to this in my life is with the Kipsigis people that I lived with. I've told you many times that the Kipsigis gave 3 different names to babies when they were born. First had to do with the circumstances of the birth, whether the birth was during a famine time or during the rainy period or whatever. And then the second name was an ancestral name. But there was another sacred, secret name that only the mother knew. Only the mother could know this name for the child, and only the mother had the ability to pronounce this name over the child. And she would only pronounce the name in times of crisis, and nobody else knew this name. And it wasn't just like a pet name. It was that really somehow the mother related to the essence of this little soul whom she bore and birthed, and that she had this connection to it, and that she would use this sacred name maybe 4 or 5 times in the life of the child. Or the adult, the subsequent adult. So that's the nearest thing I've seen to it, in waking consciousness. But that is the sense that you have here this morning. That when you know your own name, you know your soul, and you know your purpose. You know why you're here, you know who you are, and you know why you are here. But until we know our names, we don't know that. If we identify with, the Sean tag or, the Ron tag or whatever, we still haven't understood who we are, of our purposes. Which brings me to the last point of the third reading today. This very enigmatic discourse where Jesus is with a group of the disciples and he says to them, compare me with somebody and tell me what I'm like. And Simon Peter says, you are like a just angel. And Matthew says, you are like a wise philosopher. And then Thomas says, Lord, my mouth is totally incapable of describing who you are. And Jesus is looking at Thomas, and he's not looking just into his eyes. There's a telepathic communication. Jesus sees what Thomas knows. And Jesus knows that Thomas knows who Jesus is. And it is so profound, it can't be spoken. Peter's messing around with, angel terms, and Matthew's messing around with wise philosophers. They don't get him. They're getting kind of the external. They're getting the fact that Jesus was compassionate, so he's like an angel, or that he was very, very eloquent and wise, and therefore he's a philosopher, but they're not getting the essence. Thomas got the essence, and therefore it was unpronounceable. He couldn't say what it was, but he had it in his mind, and Jesus telepathically picked up and knew that Thomas knew who Jesus was. So he says to Thomas, come here, I'm going to talk to you. And he takes him aside, and he speaks 3 things to him. And Thomas comes back to the group, and they want to know, what did he say to you? And Thomas says, I'm afraid to tell you. If I tell you one of the things that he said to me, you're going to take up the rocks and you're going to stone me. And I guarantee you, if you do, the rocks will devour you. Now, he's wise not to tell with them, because Mary of Magdala had exactly the same problem with the same group. In the Gospel of Mary, there's a story where Mary has an encounter with the risen Jesus, and the disciples say, tell us what he told you. And Mary began to tell them, and they said, there's no way he told that to you. You're just a mere woman. Yeah, are we going to believe her? And there's this big argument, and Peter's in the forefront of the argument again, telling Mary that she's making up stuff. So obviously Thomas had been privy to this. He's not going to take the same risk that Mary took. So he said, I can't tell you. If I tell you one of the things that he said to me, you'll take up those rocks and you'll stone me to death. And as you're doing it, the rocks will devour you. So what was this conversation that took place over here? I think the conversation was this. I'm going to stitch it together with an earlier conversation which you find in the Synoptics. There's a story in all three Synoptics in which Jesus is on the road to a town called Caesarea Philippi. And he's walking away ahead of the disciples. And he's thinking about his own mission and what's coming up. And he stops all of a sudden, and the disciples catch up with him. And he says to them, "Who do people think that I am?" And they say, "Some people think you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're one of the Old Testament prophets." And Jesus says, "Okay. You guys have been with me now for 3 years. What about you? Who do you think that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Mashiach. You are the Son of the living God." Now, there was a third question, the one that Jesus had been asking himself, which is not recorded in the Synoptics. And that is the question that Jesus was asking, who do I think that I am? It is not that important who people think I am. It's not even that important who my friends think I might be. It's much more important what my self-identity is. And it was only when Jesus had figured that one out for himself that he could begin his public ministry. So here's what happened over here when Peter and Thomas are speaking, as far as I'm concerned. Jesus looked into Thomas's eyes and he said, "Who are you?" And Thomas said, "Thomas." And Jesus said, No. "Who are you?" And Thomas looked at Jesus, and there's this telepathic download. And Thomas says, "I am the Word of God made flesh." Jesus, yeah. Thomas came back to the group, and they said, "What did he say to you?" And Thomas said, "I can't tell you. If I tell you what he said to me, you'll stone me." If the apostles had been able to listen, if they listened with their ego, they would have stoned him. If they had listened with their own souls, they would have said to him, "Namaste."